Okay, today we are on page Mem Bet. We're starting at the bottom of Mem Aleph Amud Bet with the words Sha'alu et ben Zomah. So we're in the middle of talking about Berachot in the middle of a meal, and what the status is of foods that we eat in the middle of the meal, as we discussed yesterday about fruit and so on and so forth. So Sha'alu et ben Zomah, they asked Ben Zomah, Mipnei ma amru dvarim habayim mehammat ha'seuda betoch ha'seuda einam te'unim beracha lo lifnehem velo la'acharehem. What's the reason why we said that most foods that you eat in the middle of a meal, if they come for the main meal, you don't have to say a beracha before, and you don't have to say a beracha afterwards. As we learned yesterday, there are exceptions. If something comes and it's not considered a core part of the meal, like fruit, then there's a difference. But if something comes and it's a part of the meal, you don't say a beracha, not before and not afterwards. So Amar Lahem, he said to them, Mo'ilu pat potartan, the reason why there's no need to say a beracha before and there's no need to say a beracha afterwards is because you say the beracha on bread prior to the meal. That beracha is going to cover all other potential berachot you would have to say in the middle of the meal, and you say birkat hamazon at the conclusion of the meal. That birkat hamazon is going to cover everything that you have in the middle of the meal. So we know that from Shabbat, where we say hamotzi, and more or less we don't have to say any other berachot the rest of the time. So then the Gemara, of course, asks, if that's the case, that bread is so powerful it can cover everything, so yain nami nifterei pat. So why don't we also say that bread will cover wine? Why is it that we know that if one has a meal, for instance, let's say it's not Shabbat, so you haven't had any wine before the meal, and you come in the middle of a meal and you decide to bring a bottle of wine. So we all know, or we should know, that the halacha is, in that case, you do have to say borei priya gefen on the wine. You cannot say, well, I'm in the middle of a meal. If you drink soda in the middle of the meal, if you have water in the middle of the meal, so the accepted halacha in that case is that it's considered part of the meal, but wine is not. So why don't we apply the same rule to wine? So it says Shaneh yain. Shaneh yain. Yain is different. Wine is different. As we move to Mem Bet Amud Aleph, de gorem beracha la'atzmo, because it has its own beracha. It causes its own beracha. What does Rashi say that means? He says that there are many times where we make a beracha on wine, even though we don't even need to drink it. In other words, it has a status that's distinct from all other foods because it's used for kiddush, it's used for havdalah. It's not just something that's part of a meal, but it sort of stands above all other food items, and that's why it has a beracha of its own, meaning to say that it has a role and a status all its own as wine. And there's another interpretation of this term, gorem beracha la'atzmo, that it has a beracha of its own, meaning that unlike all other fruits, like grapes for instance, by themselves you would say borei priya etz, but when it comes to wine, it has its own unique beracha, borei priya gefen, because its status is so high. So according to that interpretation that's brought in Tosafot, the reason why bread doesn't cover it is because that beracha cannot be subsumed under other berachot, because it's a unique beracha, the beracha of gefen. So either because wine has a special status because of its ritual use, or because the blessing of borei priya gefen is a unique blessing that can't be covered by anything else. Once upon a time, Rav Huna was feeling very hungry, and he had 13 rolls or some kinds of loaves, each of which had 3 kabim of flour in it, which means to say these were pretty significant rolls that he had here. Velo barich, and he didn't say any concluding beracha, even though we had all of this. So Amar le Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said, Adei kafna, are you eating? Are you still hungry? In other words, it's another way of saying, you must have been really, really hungry to eat this much, and you didn't say a beracha. What does he mean to say this didn't satisfy you? So according to Rashi, what is the reason why he didn't say a beracha here? So he says there are some who say that the reason why is because it says v'achalta v'stavata, you have to eat and be satisfied. And since he didn't eat enough to be satisfied because he was so very hungry, that's what Rav Nachman is saying to him. What's going on here? You're still hungry. That's why he didn't say the beracha. But Rashi says that can't be the reason, because we know that even if you eat a kazayit or a kabetza, you also have to say a beracha afterwards. You don't have to be full. So what does it mean? It's talking about pata babakisnin, which is the special case of mizonot foods. Mizonot foods, like for example bread that's mixed with other things, with honey, with other ingredients. So it's like a sweet bread, it's like a pastry or something like that. So if a person eats that by itself, it's not hamotzi, but if he eats so much that a person would normally consider it a meal, so then we know, then he says hamotzi, that's like the case of egg matzah. person eats egg matzah, so they can make it into a meal if they eat a certain amount of it that's considered kiviut seudah. So he said that this 13 rolls of whatever this special bread was that is not normally hamotzi, it wasn't enough for me to be a seudah, so I said mizonot. Either it's whatever it has mixed in it. It could be eggs. It could be any other ingredients. Right? Some oil, whatever makes it mizonot. So he said that it wasn't enough for seudah for me. So he said, "Ela kol shachirim kovim alav seudah tzarich levarech." Rather, Rav Nachman said, anything that a normal person would consider a meal, that's enough. So even though in your case you think 13 rolls is not enough, you know those mizonot rolls that they have, you think 13 is not enough, for a normal person 13 is definitely enough, so you have to consider it seudah, even though for you personally you're not satisfied, you don't think it's enough. Rav Yehuda ha'asik le'levrei Be Rav Yehuda bar Chaviva. Rav Yehuda was preparing for a wedding for his son in the house of Rav Yehuda bar Chaviva. They brought in front of them this mizonot kind of a bread. Ki ata Sham'inu dekamevarche hamotzi. When he came by, he heard that they were saying hamotzi on it. Amar lahu, he said to them, "My tzitzi dekashavana." What is this tzitzi that I hear? In other words, he heard hamotzi. So he said, "What is this sound of tzitzi that I hear instead of mizonot?" He said, "What's going on here? Dilma hamotzi lachem min haaretz kamevarchitu." Are you saying the blessing of hamotzi on this pata baba kisanin? This pata baba kisanin, which is either there are different interpretations. Either it means that the dough was kneaded with something sweet, or with eggs, or with oil, and that's what makes it mizonot, or it means that it's like a calzone, that it's dough, that there's something inserted in it. Something's inserted in it, and that's what makes it pata baba kisanin. So there are different interpretations of what it means. Okay? Or crackers, it could be. So whatever the case may be, however you interpret the term, it's some kind of thing. It should have been mizonot. So Amrele, they said to him, yes, Titania Rabbi Muna Amar Mishum Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Muna said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, pata baba kisanin mevarchin alei hamotzi. Because Rabbi Muna said that Rabbi Yehuda said you're supposed to say hamotzi. Amar Shmuel halakha Rabbi Muna, and Shmuel had said that the halakha follows Rabbi Muna. But Amar lahu, he said back to them, En halakha Rabbi Muna itmar. What it was said was the halakha doesn't follow Rabbi Muna. Not that it does. Say Amar le. So itmar. So they said Amre le. I'm sorry, I'm going backwards. Okay. Amrele, they said to him, Vaha marhu damar mishmei de Shmuel. But did not the master say in the name of Shmuel, Lachmaniot me'arevin behen u'mevarachin alein hamotzi? Didn't you yourself say that you can use lachmaniot, which here means, again, these kinds of breads that did not have normally the status of hamotzi. There was something in them mixed into them. Either they were crackers or they were biscuits. They were something other than normal bread. But you told us that you say hamotzi on them, and me'arvin behen. We learned about eruv chatzerot, which is where people live. They share a courtyard, and they share a courtyard which is a walled courtyard. So rabbinically, they have to do something called eruv chatzerot to be able to carry in this courtyard. So they use bread and they put it in one of the houses, and that bread serves as the eruv chatzerot, and then they're able to carry it in the courtyard. So he said, now you have to use bread for that, and you told us that lachmaniot, these either wafers or whatever they are, what we would normally consider mizonot, you told us it's hamotzi, and you told us that you can make the eruv with it. So shanei hatam dekavasu datei alayu. That's different, he said, because over there they were making it their seudah. If you make it your seudah, even if it's biscuits or wafers, whatever we're talking about here exactly, it becomes hamotzi. But in a case where you did not make your seudah on it, in other words, you didn't need enough, you had just a few crackers, or you had just a few wafers, or you had just a little bit of calzone, it's not going to be kovea seudah. Okay. Yeah, what did you want to say?
So what happens when you don't have the intention to make it a seudah? Then you're going to snack.
And then you end up eating too much?
And you end up eating, and you're really full, and it comes out.
So the Shulchan Aruch says that in that case, even if you started out and you said Borei Minei Mizonot, but you ended up eating so much, you can say Birkat HaMazon at the end.
No, what is the criteria of Mizonot and hamotzi?
Okay, so it's a complicated subject. There are a lot of different views. So there are a lot of different views. So the simplest difference is that when you start adding ingredients other than the ingredients of bread, like you put in, for example, eggs, or you put in spices, that changes it. No, quantity by itself is not the point. That's not going to make it. So you can make a small roll; it would still be hamotzi. But if it's like flatter, it's like a biscuit.
Sandwich, you check the sandwich. Sandwich is a piece of bread.
Let's say croissant.
No, it's when you make it. It's when you make it. So, right, if when you bake it, that's when it's.
So pizza, you can eat
You make right. Well, maybe not 5, but most of them say 2 slices is enough. Yeah. Okay. So in any case, all right. So they say. So Rav Papa ikla lebe Rav Huna, Breder Rav Natan. Rav Papa came to the house of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Natan. Batar de gamrei sudatayu, aitula kamayu midi lemechal. After they finished eating, they brought out some snacks to eat after the meal was over. So shakal Rav Papa v'ka'achil. So he started eating. So Amrei they said to him, Lo savar lamar asur milechol. Gamar asur milechol. That once you finish, you're not allowed to eat anymore. In other words, once you finish the meal and it's time for Birkat Hamazon, Gamar asur milechol. You're not allowed to eat any further. So they brought out additional food. He should have waited till after Birkat Hamazon because they had finished the meal already and they were about to do Birkat Hamazon. Amar Lo said to them, Silek itmar. What was stated was when they take the table away. Because remember, back then they used to remove the table from in front of those who were eating before Birkat Hamazon. That was a sign that the meal was really over. As long as the table was out, that meant that the food, that the eating was still going on. So therefore, I kept eating because they hadn't taken the table away yet. Ravav Rabbi Zera iklu lebe Reish Galuta. Once Rav and Rabbi Zera were at the house of the Reish Galuta, the Exilarch. Levatar de Saliku. After they finished and they took saliku taka mikamayu, they took the tables away from them. Shadrulahu ristana mi beresh galuta. Then the Reish Galuta sent them a nice extra portion to eat. So they had taken. Everyone had their own little, remember TV dinner, little tables you have, right? Everybody had their own little. That's a long time ago. They don't have those anymore. But they took all the mini tables away from the individuals, and then all of a sudden, so you would think it's time for Birkat Hamazon. You can't eat anymore. But then they brought them a special gift from the table of the Reish Galuta, who wanted them to share in it. So Rava went ahead and ate it. Rabbi Zera lo achil. Rabbi Zera said, no, we can't eat. Amar le lo savar lamar silek asur milachol. So Rabbi Zera said to Rava, don't you agree with the principle that once they take away the table, that means our meal is over and we have to do Birkat Hamazon? We can't eat without saying another beracha. It doesn't mean you're not allowed to eat. What it means is you're not allowed to eat without saying another beracha, because it's considered as if the meal is over. Amar le said to him, Anan atachad Reish Galuta samchinan. We are the invitees, we are the guests of the Reish Galuta. Until his table is removed, the meal is still going on. Okay, so even though our plate, so to speak, our table was taken away, as long as the meal's still going on, it's not considered over because the host determines when it's over. We don't determine that. Amar Rav said, Haragil b'shemen shemen me'akavo. That one who normally cleans their hands, nowadays we clean our hands with water from Mayim Achronim. Some people also used to put some oil on their hands after the meal. They would rub oil on their hands. So somebody who has a custom like that, the meal is not over until they rub oil on their hands. Rubbing oil on your hands was a sign that you were about to do Birkat Hamazon. Amar Rav Ashi said, Ki avenan be Rav Kahana, when I was at Rav Kahana's house, Amar lan, he said to us, Kigon anan diragilinan b'mishcha, mishcha me'akvalan. So for people like us, where we always put oil on our hands before we do Birkat Hamazon, for us, until we've put oil on our hands, that means the meal's still going on. We haven't concluded the meal, and you can eat without saying an additional beracha. But we don't agree with any of these previous statements. We don't agree that taking the table away concludes the meal. We don't believe that finishing eating concludes the meal. We don't even agree that putting oil on your hands really concludes the meal. It's like Rav Chia bar Ashi said in the name of Rav, Shalosh techifoten. There are 3 things that need to be immediately consecutive. What are they? Techef l'smicha shechita. When they would offer a korban in the Beit HaMikdash, they would lean on the korban and only then slaughter the korban. So right after you lean on the korban, you have to slaughter it. Techef legeula tefillah. When you say the blessing of Ga'al Yisrael in Shacharit, right away Hashem sifatai tiftach. No interruptions between Geula and Tefillah. And Techav l'netilat yadayim beracha. And right after you wash your hands, you have to say the beracha. This is talking about Mayim Achronim, not Mayim Rishonim, not the water not the washing before the meal, the washing after the meal before Birkat Hamazon. Right after you wash your hands for Mayim Achronim, you have to go right into the Birkat Hamazon, which means to say that therefore, once you've washed your hands, the meal is officially over, and you can no longer eat anything without saying a beracha. The Rishonim say that another variation of this would be, let's say, in a group that they're not accustomed to doing Mayim Achronim. So then, once they say, let's do Birkat Hamazon, the meal is over. Once they agree to do Birkat HaMazon, even if somebody brings out food after that, they're allowed to eat it, but they have to say a new bracha. They can't rely on the hamotzi because they had already taken their mind away from that hamotzi already. According to the people that don't do it nowadays, there are some people who don't have the custom to do it, and it's brought in Tosafot and things that they didn't have melach sidomit. They didn't have the type of salt that they used to have in the old days. So some communities didn't do mayim achronim. So once they said let's do birkat hamazon, that's a sign that they don't want their hamotzi to cover anything further. They're done.
Even according to Rabbi Elisha, the Ashkenazim should be doing mayim.
Well, there are many. There are many
the ones who say you don't do it.
Yeah.
We never done it anymore.
No.
I'm getting confused, but maybe it's just me.
Okay.
Yesterday we talked about anything coming, we talked about dessert.
Right.
Requires its own bracha.
Right.
That's covered here too. That's included in what you just said.
That's even if you didn't say let's do Birkat HaMazon yet, and they bring fruit.
Yeah.
Fruit isn't covered by hamotzi.
Right.
Okay, but here we're saying even if let's say you said let's do Birkat HaMazon and they brought more meat that would be part of the meal. You can't. You would have to say another bracha.
It's not just what the substance of the food was.
It's the fact that the meal is over. Right. It's like you took your mind away from the meal. So Amar Abaye said, "Af anu nomar." We would also say, according to Abaye, "Techav v'talmidei chachamim beracha." That when you bring talmidei chachamim into your home, it brings blessing. Shenemar, as it says in the story of Lavan, says to Yaakov, he says, "Vayivaracheni Hashem beglalecha." That Hashem has blessed me because of you. Ibait Ema, an alternative source, Mehacha, Shene'emar, as it says, Vayivarech Hashem et Beit HaMitzri, Vayivarech Hashem et Beit HaMitzri, Beglal Yosef, that Hashem had blessed the house of the Mitzri, of the Egyptian, because of Yosef, and that's talking about Potiphar. So we see that when tzaddikim come into their homes, they get blessed. They get blessing coming in their homes. So the Mishnah says, "Berech al hayayin shilifnei hamazon, patar tayin shelachar hamazon." They used to bring drinks out before the meal, so they would serve wine. People do that today too. They bring some wine before the meal. Sometimes they bring arak, but that wouldn't be as relevant here. But let's say they bring wine before the meal, and you drink it. So patar tayin shelachar hamazon. So even if you eat the entire meal and then after the meal you decide to have another glass of wine when the meal is over, the blessing on the wine that you said before the meal will cover the blessing on the wine after the meal. So a classic case would be if you had kiddush in the beginning of the meal, and then you ate the meal, and during the meal you didn't have any wine, but when they took the food away, you wanted to have some wine after the meal. So your borei priya gefen from kiddush will still cover the wine after the meal. Berech ala parperet shilifnei hamazon, patarta parperet shelachar hamazon. This is a very, very complicated subject. What is parperet here? What is it talking about? So there's so many different interpretations. Some kind of appetizer that came before the meal. The Rambam seems to say that parperet is some kind of a cooked dish, like fish or meat, that they would serve as an appetizer before they did hamotzi. Rashi seems to say, and Tosafot seem to say, that it's some kind of mizonot that they would serve before the meal, and then they might also serve it after the meal.
And I see that's something like pastry.
Yeah. So Rashi has a very confusing position. Rashi says that before the meal they would serve like fish or little pieces of meat as an appetizer, and then after the meal they would serve some kind of mizonot. Tosafot says no, before and after they would serve mizonot. The Rambam says no, it was some kind of an appetizer of a dish that was either meat or fish or something like that, both before and after. So there are lots of different interpretations of what parperet is.
Does it cover?
So that's the question. So the easiest way for us to understand it, I would say, is by using what Tosafot says, which is it was some kind of mizonot. So that's why the Mishnah has to say that if you did it before eating, so it covers also what you do after you eat. Okay? Now, and then it goes on to say, Berech alapat patarta parperet, ala parperet lo patarta pat. That if you said a bracha on the bread first, it will cover this parperet. If you said the bracha on the parperet first, it won't cover the bread. So Tosafot says, therefore you have to assume that it means some kind of mizonot. Because how could the Mishnah even think that saying a bracha on fish is going to cover hamotzi? Why would it have to tell you that, is the question.
Am I too early? Yesterday you told me the bracha on my cereal cannot cover the bracha on the cookies that I decide to have later with coffee.
Yeah, but this is all one meal. This is all one meal, though.
One
yeah.
breakfast. Okay.
Yeah.
There's some cereal and then,
Yeah, but if you had in mind of the cookies to begin with, then it wouldn't be. It's not new.
and if I didn't have it in mind,
Then you would have to say another bracha. But here we're talking about where you knew what the schedule of the meal was. So there's an appetizer. So the way the Rambam tries to understand it is that these parperet were served before the meal, but you would eat them with the bread also, and then you would eat them afterwards without the bread. So that's why you might think that, since it accompanies the bread, it could somehow cover the bread. It's a complicated thing, because at the end of the day, normally you would think that no other bracha would normally cover the motzi. So it's a little bit complicated.
You see, Rabbi, in North Africa, on Shabbat or any other holidays,
that's after the motzi. That's after the kiddush, you mean? They have the salads.
They do no mezonot, but they do shakol, and then they do.
And then they do and then they do like the salads and everything.
Fish.
So that's right. So that's like the parperet. That's like the parperet, right?
Also look like bread.
Right. So according to the
bread, you get confused.
So according to the Rambam, what you're talking about is kind of what the Gemara, what the Mishnah is talking about, because he says the parperet is different kinds of dishes that they would have before, and then they might have them afterwards. So it's like the Moroccan salads that they serve before the hamotzi. It's very similar to that. But according to Tosafot, it's some kind of mizonot thing. So the difficulty with the Rambam's approach is that it's hard to imagine that the bracha on the salad is going to cover the hamotzi, or the bracha on the fish is going to, let's say, cover the hamotzi. Although I guess he could say that it's shehakol. Shehakol can cover everything, and maybe it would work. The problem with the Tosafot is, why wouldn't the hamotzi cover the parperet if it's mizonot, and you're having it inside the meal? Why does it have to tell you that? So either way, there's somewhat of a question of what needs to be said and what doesn't need to be said here. But in any case, Beit Shammai says, Af lo Masekhet Berakhot, that just like the parperet doesn't cover the bread, so too Masekhet Berakhot, so too a wheat dish that's cooked in a pot. So we're going to see what he means. So too what? What does that mean? We're going to find out later. So Hayu Yoshvim Kol Echad Mivarech Latzmo. If the people were sitting down and eating, each person should say their own beracha. Remember, because when you were really having a communal meal, you didn't sit, you reclined. So if you're only sitting, that means you're not really together. Or you're not really together in one meal. Tosafot says for us, sitting is the same as reclining. We don't have this concept of reclining in a meal. Hesebu, once they reclined, so echad mivarech lechulan. Now one person can say the beracha for everybody. As we turn to Amud Bet, ba lehem yain betoch hamazon. If they were having wine in the middle of the meal, kol echad ve'echad mivarech la'atzmo. Each person has to say the beracha for themselves, even if they were reclining. Reason being, the Gemara is going to say, when everyone's eating, you can't have one person say a beracha for everybody, because they have food in their mouth and they can't say amen to the beracha, or somebody's going to choke trying to say amen to the one beracha that one person's saying. Okay. However, achar hamazon echad mivarech lechulan. However, at the conclusion of the meal, when the meal's been taken away and you're having dessert wine, okay, now one person can say the bracha for everybody because they're all together. Okay, so he says, Vehu omer ala mugmar. And the same person who says the bracha on wine as the dessert wine, that person also would bless on the mugmar. The mugmar was that they would bring incense out after Birkat HaMazon for everybody to smell, to bring a nice smell, and somebody would say, even though they didn't bring the mugmar until all the eating was done and even the Birkat HaMazon was done, still the person who said that the blessing on the wine at the end of the meal would also say the blessing on the mugmar when it was brought out. And nowadays, livarech ala mugmar in rabbinic idiom means to complete something. When you're saying a blessing because you were able to complete something, like complete a book, they will say livarech ala mugmar because it also sounds like the word ligmor. So they'll use that as an idiom now in rabbinic Hebrew. So
you finish Birkat HaMazon and you're having drinks.
This is talking about before Birkat HaMazon, but when the food is away, so they're having wine, so they will say the bracha on that.
No, but
okay.
My question is, after Birkat HaMazon, you're having drink, but the drink happens to be a cognac made out of grapes. So what do you do?
Right, so now you have to make another bracha, for sure. Once you say Birkat HaMazon, it erases everything you did before, pretty much. Yeah. So Amar Rabba Bar Barchana.
How about cognac?
It's wine, right?
Cognac is made out of grapes, but it's not totally wine.
It's distilled.
So what are they? I've never had it. So whiskey is shehakol for sure.
Probably just like light whiskey.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I've never had cognac, so I never inquired. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Chana said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Lo shanu ela b'shabatot v'yamim tovim ho'il v'adam kovea seudato al hayayin. Aval b'shar yomot hashana mivarech al kol kos v'kos. He said, no, this is only talking about, when did we say that when you drink wine before the meal, it covers all the wine you're going to drink during the meal, and even after the meal is over, before Birkat HaMazon, it's still going to cover it. When did we say that? Only on Shabbat and Yom Tov, because a person is kovea seudato al hayayin. He plans to drink what? Wine throughout the meal. So that's the case. But normally on the weekday, just because you had a cup of wine before you ate your meal doesn't mean you're going to have it during the meal, because you're not necessarily drinking that much. So each time they bring a new cup of wine, you have to say another bracha, because there's no expectation. In other words, it goes back to da'at. It goes back to your intention. There's no expectation that you're going to keep drinking wine throughout the meal. So when it comes, it's a chidush. It's a new thing. Itmar, they stated, Itmar nami, Amar Rabba Bar Mari, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Rabba Bar Mari said that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, Lo shanu el b'shabbatot v'yamim tovim. And so on Shabbat and Yom Tov, during those meals, we know we drink wine throughout. Or on when a person comes out of the bathhouse, I guess they thought that it was medicinally indicated that in a meal that you would have after you came out of the bathhouse, you would have a lot of wine. They probably thought that it rehydrated you, which is not true. And when a person has bloodletting, where again they would give them probably maybe for the sugar, but although the alcohol might not be a good thing at that point. But when they would do after bloodletting, they would drink a lot of wine, probably for sugar to replenish their sugar. Because in those cases, a person makes a meal with a lot of wine and there's continuous wine. But in a normal situation where you had a drink of wine before the meal, there's no assumption. There's no expectation that you're going to drink throughout the meal. Rabba Bar Mari ikla lebe Rava b'chol. Once Rabba Bar Mari came to the house of Rava during a weekday. He saw that he said Borei Priya Gefen on wine that he had prior to the meal. And then after they had finished dinner, before Birkat HaMazon, he brought another cup of wine and he said Borei Priya Gefen again. So he said to him, Amar le lo savar lamar lahad Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Oh wait, I skipped part, didn't I? Yeah. Amar la yeshar. He said to him, "You're right. What you did is correct." V'chein amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, and that's exactly what Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said. That since it's a weekday, you have to say a bracha on each cup because there's no expectation to continue drinking wine. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef ikla leber Abaye biyom tov. Here's where it's the opposite. So Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef came to the house of Abaye on a holiday. Now remember, we said on a holiday there's an expectation you're going to be drinking wine throughout the whole thing. So contrary to that, even though they had wine of kiddush before the meal, throughout the meal, whenever there was a new cup of wine brought, Abaye said another Borei Priya Gefen. Why did he do that? Amar le lo savar lamar lahal ti Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Don't you agree with what Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, that on every cup of wine on a holiday you don't have to say a bracha because there is an assumption that you're going to be drinking wine throughout the meal? Amar le nimlach ana. He said to him, I keep changing my mind. In other words, it's subjective. When you're a type of person that you are really intending to drink wine throughout the meal, then you can rely on that. But Abaye is saying, I kept saying to myself, oh, this is the last one I'm going to have tonight. And then they would offer him another, and he said, you know what, I'll have another one. So it is somewhat subjective. If after Kiddush you said, you know what, I'm not going to touch the wine the rest of the time, even though it's Shabbat or Yom Tov, and then they offer you another one, you have to say Borei Priya Gefen because you thought to yourself before, I'm not going to have any more. So each time they kept offering him another one, and he couldn't resist. He kept telling himself, I'm done with it. And then they brought him another one. So that's why he had to say Borei Priya Gefen again.
But if your intention is, well, I don't know, but if I have any more wine, this bracha covers any wine that I
If you said to yourself, that would work. Yeah, you can have a general blanket exception. Yeah, the Tosafot mentions that in some connection actually to the maror and Borei Priya Hadam the maror and things like that. So Amar le. Okay, so Ibailu, they asked a question. So we have a case in the Mishnah that if you drink wine before the meal, then wine that you drink during the meal and wine that you drink after the meal before Birkat HaMazon is all covered by the Borei Priya Gefen of before the meal. So in the case of Kiddush, you said Kiddush, then you had wine during the meal, and then you took the food away, you had wine after the meal. All of it is under the blanket of the first Borei Priya Gefen. But what if you didn't have wine before the meal? It's not Kiddush, it's a regular weekday. Or let's say it's Sudash Lishit, and you didn't say Kiddush before. So you said Hamotzi, you're drinking wine during the meal, and then they took the food away, and you want to have another glass of wine. Okay, so does the Borei Priya Geffen you said during the meal cover for after the meal is over? We know that before the meal covers during and after. Does during the meal cover after the meal? That's the question. So Ma'ushi Yiftor Tein Shelachar Ramazon. So Im Timtze Lomar, if you're going to tell me Berech Alayan Shelafnei Ramazon Poter Tegan Shelachar Ramazon, we know that blessing on wine before the meal covers wine that's drunk after the meal. Mishum dezel lishtot v'zel lishtot, because in both cases you're just drinking. You drank wine before the meal, that was just to drink. When you drink wine after the meal, it's also just to drink. It's not accompanied by food. But avalacha dezel lishtot v'zel lishrot. But in this case, one is to drink and one is to accompany, to help get the food down, right? Because you're drinking while you're eating. So that's different. Oh, so you might say you might say no, it's not going to apply here. In other words, drinking during the meal is one type of drinking of wine, which is a drinking of wine that is to help wash down the food. That doesn't cover wine that you're going to drink just for drinking's sake after you're done eating. O dilma lo shana, or maybe it would cover. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe as long as you said Borei Priya Geffen, even during the meal, it will cover the wine after the meal. So Rav Amar Poter, Rav says it works. If you drink wine during the meal, then even when they clear away the food and you drink wine again, you don't have to say Borei Priya Geffen. Rav Kana Amar Eino Poter, and Rav Kana says it doesn't work. If you drink wine only during the eating, then that doesn't necessarily cover wine after the eating is done. Rav Nachman Amar Poter, Rav Nachman says it does work. Rav Sheshet Amar Eino Poter, and Rav Sheshet says it doesn't work. Rav Huna Rav Yehuda v'chol Talmidei Rav Amar Eino Poter, even though Rav himself said that drinking wine during the meal, even after they clear away the food, covers the wine that you drink after the meal. His students, Rav Kana and all the students of Rav, said it doesn't work.
Well, can we establish that it just has to do with your intention?
Because they want to say that it's a different kind of drinking, so they're saying it's in a different category.
But one may have the intention to.
I suppose that if you thought to yourself, you had that intention from the beginning, it probably would work. But we're just talking about stam, right? Where the person didn't have any intention. So if you can use intention, right? It just happened. They drank in the middle of the meal, and then they said, you know what? I'd like to have another cup of wine, and since I already started drinking, I'm not going to say another bracha. That's what we're talking about. So we're not talking about a case where he specifically, explicitly said, oh, I'm going to drink now, and I want it to cover all the drinking that I do from now on, because that's totally different. So Eitive, they raised an objection. Rava raised an objection to Rav Nachman. How could you say it doesn't work? How can you say that it works? How can you say that the wine that you drank during the meal is going to cover wine that you drink after the meal is over? But it said in the Mishnah that if wine comes to them in the middle of the meal, then each person has to say a bracha for themselves. And then if wine comes after the meal is over, after they're done eating, one person says the bracha for everybody. So what do you see from that? You see that even though wine came in the middle of the meal, and each person said their own bracha, when the eating was over, somebody still said a bracha in the Borei Priya Geffen when they brought wine again. So what do you see from that? That blessing that they said in the middle of the meal didn't cover. So Amar lehachika Amar, you're reading the Mishnah wrong. It's two different cases. The first one is if wine comes in the middle of the meal, who says the bracha? Which is, each person has to say it for themselves. Im lo balem yain b'toch hamazon ela lachar hamazon. And the second case is if wine didn't come in the middle of the meal, it only came after the meal. There, echad mivarach l'chulam, then one person blesses for everybody. But Rav Nachman defends his position that if they said a bracha on the wine already in the middle of the meal, automatically it's going to cover the wine after the meal. Now the halacha happens to be the opposite of that. The halacha follows, because even though Rav, usually the halacha kirav, that the halacha would follow Rav, that be'isurei, usually the halacha kirav be'isurei, which means the halacha follows Rav in ritual matters, which would mean that the wine that you drink during the meal should cover the wine after the meal. Since all of his students disagreed with him, they all went against him, we say that maybe he himself retracted, and wine that you have during the middle of the meal is not going to cover wine after the meal, unless, of course, you explicitly said, when you said that beracha in the middle of the meal, I want this wine blessing to cover every drop of wine that I have for the rest of the time, because I know I'm going to have wine after the meal. That's a different story. Okay, so now we get to the next part of the Mishnah. where it said, Berech alapat patarta parperet. So if you say a bracha on the bread, it's going to cover the parperet, whatever that is, whatever those appetizers are. Ala parperet lo patarta pat. If you said the blessing on those appetizers, they're not going to cover the bread. Okay? Beit Shammai omrim af lo Masekhet Berakhot. And Beit Shammai say, even not cooked wheat dish. Even not what? What are they talking about? So that's what the Gemara is going to ask. They asked the question, Beit Shammai Resha Pligei, or Dilma Sefa Pligei. Which part of the Mishnah are Beit Shammai talking about? Okay, Asefa. So Dekamarta Nakama Berech Alapat Patarata Parperet V'Kol Sheken Masekhet Berakhot. Is this what it means? That when the Mishnah said, when you say a bracha on bread, it covers the appetizers that you eat in the meal. So V'Kol Sheken Masekhet Berakhot, and it certainly would cover a wheat dish that you served at the meal. And Beit Shammai is saying, not only does bread not cover those appetizers, in other words, if you cleared away the food and then you brought these appetizers at the end of the meal, not only is the bread not going to cover them, even if you were to bring a wheat dish as dessert, so to speak, the bread is not going to cover it. Okay? Dilma, or maybe as sefa plige, it's talking about the end. Dekatani berech ala parperet lo patar tapat, because it says if you made a bracha on the appetizer, that's not going to cover the bread. And patu de lo patar val masek de rapatar, with the implication being that it's true that it won't cover the bread. In other words, you had these appetizers prior to the meal. Then you still have to say hamotzi. But at the end of the meal, if you were to bring more of these parperets to the table, or you are going to bring Masekhet Berakhot, you're going to bring a wheat dish to the table after the meal, it would cover it. V'atu Beit Shammai lememar, and Beit Shammai come along and say, V'afilu Masekhet Berakhot nami lo patar, that even the Masekhet Berakhot won't be covered by that parperet teku. So are they talking about what the bread will cover? Okay, the first side is saying they're talking about what the bread will cover. That the bread won't cover. If you take food away in the middle of the meal, and then you bring parperet, you bring this kind of appetizers, whatever they are, or you bring Masekhet Berakhot, you bring some kind of wheat dish after the meal is over, Beit Shammai is saying the bread won't cover them. Even though normally we would say that since they're mechamata seudah, they're kind of like the thing that you would normally have during a meal, so it should cover them. They're not a dessert really. So it should cover them. But Beit Shammai is saying, no, even something like Masekhet Berakhot, which is definitely a core dish at the meal, wouldn't be covered if you took all the food away and then you serve it after the food. Or is what Beit Shammai commenting on is the other case, that the fact that the appetizers don't cover the bread, but they do cover appetizers that you would have at the end of the meal. And Beit Shammai is coming along and saying that no, not only do the appetizers not cover the bread, the appetizers won't cover Masekhet Berakhot, they won't cover a wheat dish that you eat at the end of the meal. Now this obviously would seem to support the idea that whatever this parperet is some kind of mizonot. And therefore, even though you had mizonot before the meal, and then at the end of the meal, when the food is away, they bring mizonot again, Beit Shammai is saying that mizonot that you said a bracha in the beginning is not going to cover that post-meal mizonot at the end. And the rabbis apparently would hold, implication being that they would hold that mizonot would cover it. So let's take, for example, let's say we served before the meal, we served some kind of mizonot appetizer, and then you had hamotzi, and then at the end they brought out coffee cake. Okay? Or something like that. So you could say that's what we're talking about here. Since you said a mizonot prior to the meal, for the extraneous items other than the meal, that mizonot could actually cover a mizonot that comes at the end of the meal when the food is all cleared away. If you just said hamotzi and then you got to that dessert, now it would be like a new thing. It wouldn't cover that because it doesn't go with the bread. But since you said an extra mizonot before on extra meal, extraneous additions to the meal, like the mizonot appetizer, so then when the mizonot dessert came after the meal, that would cover it. And that's actually, that would seem to be what the halacha is, that if you did that, we don't do that usually today, but if one were to do that, then it would in fact cover that mizonot even later in the meal, even though in an ordinary case you would have to say mizonot on cake that came at the end of the meal, because it's not something that goes along with the bread. So Beit Shammai is saying that no, that doesn't work. That wouldn't work. So that's basically where we leave the Gemara for today, and we'll continue at the bottom. Actually, you know what? Let's go just a tad bit further. We might as well, because we're still early. So we might as well go just a little bit further. So they leave that with the teiko. We don't really know what Beit Shammai's position is in the end, and we'll go just to the next part. We said that if they're sitting, then it's not considered to be kiviut. It's not considered to be that they're together. So hesebu in lo hesebu lo. That if they recline, one person can say the bracha for everybody because they're considered together. If they don't recline, it's not that way. Or aminu, but we raise an objection. Asara shayu holachin baderech. If there were 10 people walking on the way, afal bishkulam ochlim mikikar echad. Even though they're all eating from the same loaf, kol echad v'echad mivarech la'atzmo. Everybody has to say a bracha for themselves because they're holachin baderech. They're walking. Yashvu lechol. Once they sit down to eat, afal bishkol echad v'echad ochem mikikaro echad mivarech chulam. So in the first case, even though they're walking, since they're walking, even though they eat from the same loaf, one person can't say hamoti for everybody. But when they're sitting, even if they're eating from different loaves, one person can say the bracha for everybody. So it's all about sitting down and the kaviut there. Now, he goes on to say, Katani yashavu afal pi shelo hesebu. So this is a problem because yashavu, when they sit down to eat, even though they didn't recline, apparently that's enough. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak kegon damrei nezel v'nechol lachma beduch pelan. The answer is that it's not about the bodily position alone. It's about the fact that they had a common agreement to sit down and eat. So when they're traveling, when they're olchim baderech, each person might be eating from the same loaf, but they didn't coordinate and say, okay, it's mealtime now. When they sit down to eat, it's not that they're sitting versus reclining. It's that when you're sitting, usually each person is coming as they are, on their own. When you're reclining, it means we're all together. We've all decided to eat here. So when they say, let's eat in this place, even if all they do is sit in that place, they don't recline, it's still considered to be kviut. So that's why sitting in this case would be sufficient. Now we have a nice little story to conclude. When Rav died, Azlu Talmidav Batre, this is a very famous story. His students took him out to be buried. Ki Hadre, when they came back, they said, let's sit down by the river Dunk and we will have some bread. After they had their meal, they said, hey, wait a second, we don't know what to do now. Why? Do you have to recline in order for one person now to say the bracha for everybody? Or is sitting down enough? Lo hava biyadayu. They didn't know what to do. They didn't have it in their hands, meaning they didn't have an answer. So kam Rav Ada bar Ava. Rav Ada bar Ava. I'm sorry, I skipped the line again. Okay, or maybe the fact that they all sat down in one place and they said, let's eat in this place together is enough. In other words, do you have to recline? Like the question that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak asked before, they're asking now. Does the fact that it says recline, does that mean that you must recline? Sitting is not enough to say that we're all together, and one person can say the hamotzi for everybody, and one person can say Birkat Hamazon for everybody? Or does it actually have to be? So does that have to be reclining, or just the fact that they designated a location for them to eat together? And that would be equivalent of reclining. So lo hava biyadayu, they didn't know the answer. Kam Rav Ada bar Ava ahader kar'e la'achorei. We turn to Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. He turned his shirt backwards because they had torn their garment when Rav died. So he turned it backwards and he tore it again. V'kara kriya achrina. He tore it again. Amar nach nafshe derav ubirkat mizona lo gamrinan. So this is a very, very famous line, a very famous story that they said Rav has died and we don't even know how to say Birkat Hamazon. Okay, so then they went. So ad datahu saba, until a certain older person came. Ramalu matnitina baraita v'shanelu kevan da'amri nezav nechol lachma beduch palan keisei budami. Until somebody came and showed the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Baraita, which was exactly what we saw from Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak before, and concluded by saying that the decision to eat in one place together is equivalent to reclining in that place. Have a great day.